Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Stephen Caruso. I'm a Capital reporter with Spotlight PA, and your moderator for tonight's events. Thank you all for spending your Monday evening with us. For those of you who are new to our programming, Spotlight PA is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit newsroom producing investigative and public service journalism about state government and urgent statewide issues. We can't do any of this work without you, our readers and donors who support us in numerous ways. You can learn more about us on our website, spotlightpa.org. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Tonight's event will be recorded and posted on our website tomorrow for those who could not join us tonight. Be a shame, you don't want to miss something like this. And you can also join our discussion by submitting questions during the event. You can do so in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can towards the end of our program. So now, let's get to it. This is the start of what I like to call budget season, lovingly. It's May. We're getting into June. The state has to pass a new spending plan by June 30th of every year. Now, if they hit that, that's another matter. We'll get to that. This process starts in February when the governor, currently Josh Shapiro, proposes a budget plan. He proposed a $51.7 billion plan in his address. It called for more money for public education and transit, with more revenue coming from the legalization of skill games and recreational marijuana. Then what comes after that are a bunch of hearings, press conferences, public debate over the parameters of the budget, what people can support, what people can't. And all of this is further complicated by the fact that Pennsylvania at the time, and we have been for years, is running a structural deficit. We very historically have been spending about as much money as we're bringing in, if not a little bit more, and balancing it with one-time gimmicks such as legalization of gambling, accounting tricks, all sorts of things that you usually can't get away with it in the private sector. But to try and pick apart what the governor proposed, as well as what's on the table and what's not, I have Senator Scott Martin here with me. He is the appropriations chair of the Senate Republicans who have the majority. Thank you for joining us, Senator.
No, it's great to be with you, Stephen. Thank you for having me.
So, I want to get started by I mentioned this idea of the fact that we've had a structural deficit. We also, though, have the state has a lot of money. It's about 13, we had about $13 billion in 2023. I believe it's now down to about $11 billion in excess revenue. This was built up over the course of the pandemic due to federal funding. We had higher than expected tax revenues. All that money is there. But the governor for his proposal, he calls for using some of those dollars to balance the budget. So I'm just curious, at this point, will Senate Republicans agree to a deal that reaches into those reserves to balance this year's or the upcoming year's budget?
I appreciate you starting off with that. And just to break it down for those who are watching, when you look at what's remaining in reserves, you have two different types of categories. You have money that's part of our general fund balance, which right now we're looking at hopefully wrapping up the current 2024-2025 fiscal year with about $3 billion left in that fund balance. Then you have Pennsylvania's rainy day fund. And the rainy day fund, which, as you're aware, is something that we've really worked to try to build up over the last probably four budget cycles, where we basically had, I think, enough money to operate state government for 10 minutes 4 years ago when we started to focus on this, to now having about 7.4 billion dollars in that rainy day fund. And so what we're currently looking at, and you had referenced with the state structural deficit, and many things have contributed to that. Yes, we did see higher revenues for a period of time, but what it comes down to is our spending growth over a period of time has exceeded the rate of growth in revenue. When you combine that with, as you're aware, we got a lot of different emergency type of federal dollars throughout COVID. Probably the biggest portion of that was with Medicaid, and a lot of that supplemental extra revenue that came in actually ended December 31st of 2023. So if we're running, let's say, a current, let's say $5 billion structural deficit, and you're only going to end this current fiscal year with about $3 billion in the fund balance, that leaves a $2 billion gap in terms of where you're going to draw money from in order to fund that spending level. And so one of our big concerns is that that kind of size of a structural deficit, if not addressed, whether it's on the spending side or the revenue side, that next year, when we're looking at the 26-27 budget, which we will be negotiating, you laid out that process in the spring of next year, that we literally could be negotiating a budget that has a significant $6 billion budget hole. And there's only three ways to do that: with no money left in your fund balance, no money left in your rainy day fund, and then you're left with either big tax hikes, big spending cuts, or a combination of both.
Yeah, and so with that said, you mentioned this idea that the state, we've had a lot of costs that add up. I mean, the state has, there's been a big increase in Medicaid. Pennsylvania has an aging population overall. Some of those folks need Medicaid, overall an aging population, more expensive to care for. Um, and that has been a consistent trend the state has seen. Um, is there a way to start to turn that around in this budget, and what are Senate Republicans proposing? Because I mean, that's the other thing. The other thing, that the way you fix it is you just have to have economic growth. Is there anything you think Senate Republicans are proposing at this point that could start to do that?
Well, as you're aware, the COVID years really kind of put the Medicaid issue on the back burner, right? No one was really talking about it. But if you even go back prior to COVID, I'll tell you, one of my first bills I ever worked on was a Medicaid reform bill, and it got vetoed by Governor Wolf. We recognize that Medicaid is one of the largest cost driver in the state budget. And you are correct. We're an aging state. Long-term care costs are on the rise. But it wasn't the only thing. There are things along the way that, whether they were legislatively driven, adding in the coverage for a new type of care to be covered by Medicaid, whether there were changes that the federal government may have made or changes that they prohibit us from making, all came into play. I'm just going to also use a recent thing that happened. I think everyone's heard of, like, the Ozempics, right? And when you think about the Ozempics, and the official terminology for the GLP-1s that they have, very expensive, medication. But when it was rolled out, it wasn't rolled out that saying this is only for people with diabetes or people who are pre-diabetic or any kind of pre-authorization. These things ended up being utilized in a fashion, probably for weight loss, that really got ramped up. And so we were looking at just that issue alone could have added about $1 billion to some of our strains financially related to Medicaid. You also think about, if you recall, the administration under the Biden administration had applied for an 1115 waiver. They want to use Medicaid to pay for 6 months of rent for inmates coming out of prison, or to buy pots and pans and furniture, to pay for different at-home grocery delivery services, things like that, well beyond what you might consider to be healthcare or pharmacy or anything like that. Well, in December, going out the door, the Biden administration approved that waiver. Well, if this would be fully implemented, just so your viewers realize, it could be about another $1.6 billion hit to Pennsylvania in additional costs, and another 3 point whatever to the federal government. So there's things that have been baked into Medicaid over the years that have really helped accelerate its growth. And what's happening in DC right now, which none of us can predict what the final outcome will be, how does the Trump administration change Medicaid? How do they put, work requirements or educational requirements or job training requirements on it? Do they want you to go to check if folks are still eligible more often than once a year? There's going to be a lot of different things that could potentially happen that would have a great impact on it. All I know is this: when I came into Harrisburg in 2017, I think Medicaid was about a $27 billion federal and state program. It's now $40 billion. So it's grown tremendously, and it'll continue to be one of the number one issues in Pennsylvania that impacts us. And it's important too, because, and I just put this out there, if you can't keep pace with your revenues with the growth of this program, what happens is it starts to impact other types of programs. Or if you can't keep pace with the cost, it lends government to take a shortcut and say, well, we only can afford to reimburse a provider a certain amount of money on the dollar. And we're starting to see negative impacts of that. A few years ago, it was dentists. You couldn't find a dentist hardly anywhere that would accept Medicaid because it was only accepting, they were paying 29 cents on the dollar. Well, no one goes into business to lose money. And if you don't have enough people coming through your doors to potentially make up the difference, or you're not a large hospital entity that can cost shift on the private insurance plans, meaning, if we both have knee surgeries and you have Medicaid and I'm on private insurance, if they're only paying 40 cents on the dollar for that procedure, it's okay for the hospitals to turn around and charge a private health care insurer 150% of the cost. It's those kind of games. So it's got to be addressed somehow, because it really is starting to have a huge impact.
You brought up a bunch of things that I feel like I could follow on. So I'll go back to you mentioned GLPs, the Ozempics of the world.
Yeah.
So during budget hearings, you had brought up some skepticism that if the state paying for them for Medicaid patients would be worth it. I think it's at about $1 billion for them. You're concerned about them particularly being applied in I don't know if it's off label per se, but for weight loss specifically, not for diabetes treatment. Um, there was and well, and the idea is that, that's a lot of money. As you said, $1 billion is a lot of money. There was a study from employee benefits manager Aon from April that found that like this does pay off. Obesity is a big health issue that many Americans face, and reducing obesity, there have started to be studies that are finding that this does pay off in the end. So it feels like, we could do this. We could probably go down like most of the issues is that, you know, spending money sometimes does lead to a better outcome down the road, which then leads to a healthier populace who can work. So like with GLPs, for instance, is that something that you think needs to be cut off or just rationed? Like, what is the best way to tackle that within the state budget while understanding that people can lose weight and have better outcomes that saves the state money in the long run if they
Well,
have access?
I would say this. This is a program unlike a lot of others that we implement as state government. One, because of the intertwining with the feds and the rules seem to constantly change. The other thing is the fact that you have to take in consideration when you look at different options. And if your goal is to truly to help people lose weight, surely there's other options too. Is it cheaper to pay for someone's gym membership than to pay for a shot that they have to take multiple times a month, and every time it costs, how many thousands of dollars to potentially get? That there's considerations that come with that. Certainly, putting guardrails on this to make sure. I mean, remember, Medicaid was supposed to be a safety net program. And what happens is if you keep adding in new things that cost you, especially in the category of billions of dollars, right, which is this issue is in that category, it starts to harm other services. Because again, if the rapid growth of this isn't lending you the ability to keep pace with what we put into the pot, so the answer is we're going to shortchange you and what we're going to reimburse you for, then you got kids with disabilities on waiting lists that can't get into treatment, or they can't find a provider anywhere rurally because they pull out because because we can't afford to pay the true cost of medicine. And so the other thing to think about in this conversation for folks out there is there something to be said that if the richness of the plan or the density of what it covers ends up being even better or much better than anything you could get in the private sector, right? Where we have working families busting their jobs and there's things that are covered under Medicaid that aren't covered under their private plan, you run into that scenario as well too. I just would argue that it can't be everything to everybody. The other component of this is, and I'm trying to get more recent data from the Department of Human Services, is that when you have folks that are on Medicaid that are non-disabled, non-caring for a dependent, non-elderly, non-pregnant, that are on Medicaid but report $0 as income, meaning they're just basically using this as health care. Like to me, that's not right. Like there needs to be mechanisms to incentivize people that if you're going to be part of this program, you got to help yourself as well. Whether it's job search, whether it's education, getting an education or job training. And obviously that's been a battle for a very long time, but we'll see. I know, at least from what I'm seeing in some of the versions down in DC of how they're looking at this issue, that might be part of what they put out there. But again, we need to make sure that this program ultimately we're not harming those that it originally was intended to help. Whether it's the seniors in long-term care, whether it was um, uh, uh, folks with intellectual disabilities. I mean, the list goes on. And I get worried about that as I see the rise in costs and the density of what's in these plans.
I don't want to. We have a lot of topics to cover, and I'm realizing how much I enjoy covering healthcare. But I do just
Yeah.
want to follow up on one thing on that, which is just you brought up this idea that there could be people who are not working on Medicaid. Like you bring up that idea. Have you gotten any numbers on that? Because I feel like that's something that's leveled against pretty much every entitlement program that America has offered historically for years. And a lot of times when it comes down to it, there's not that many people who fit that profile. And it
Right.
seems like healthcare is just more expensive for everyone. It seems like it's almost a systemic problem more than
Yeah.
a specific Medicaid problem.
We actually had hearings prior to COVID where we were using numbers that there was about a 500,000 people on the plan that fit the category I just said. Um, Obviously, in COVID, the doors were put wide open for people who had lost their jobs. There was a lot of people getting on Medicaid to get through COVID under the emergency declaration. And so afterwards, there was change. There was people who were no longer enrolled in it. And so we want to get updated numbers to be fair. But prior to COVID, we had statistics that have been providing to us showing about 500,000 people who fit that category. And again, I'm not saying that the answer is to automatically boot them off. I'm just saying that the folks should also have some skin in the game to want to better themselves or work towards, getting a job that has healthcare too, and that it's all part of our every issue we look at. There's people who look at it, stakeholders look at it from many different angles, but you try to address as many of those pieces that you can, and that's a piece that often comes up. For me, from the financial standpoint, and wearing my appropriations hat, we have to look at this because it is literally the rate of growth of these programs versus a Pennsylvania that is struggling to compete economically, a Pennsylvania that's demographically, we know we're aging rapidly, which means that will those costs grow even more, especially because of the long-term care kind of things. And everything's pointing to a shrinking younger generation here in Pennsylvania, which we're seeing in our data, and they're projected to go down even lower with birth replacement rates being lower. Number of kids graduating our schools continues to decline. And 2 years ago, we had the smallest kindergarten enrollment statewide since 1986. Those two things don't add up budgetarily long term. So, why we're focused on wanting to hopefully address that.
Thank you for an easy transition, which is going to be public education, because that's obviously a top issue, and feels like I have not covered a single budget where a lawmaker, doesn't matter the party, wants to walk out and talk about how much money is put into public education or just education writ large. As you know, in 2023, a state judge ruled that Pennsylvania has unconstitutionally underfunded public education. Now, last year, the General Assembly made a stab at addressing that. The budget included $500 million in adequacy for school districts that were deemed to be historically underfunded over time, using a formula looking at students and the tax base and various other factors. Since then, there have been complaints in some districts, particularly wealthy districts, that this adequacy formula is unfair to them. And the governor, in his budget proposal, he said he wants another $500 million for adequacy, but just $75 million boost for basic education, which is the money that goes out to every district, not just the districts that are deemed to be underfunded. At this point, is this a concern for Senate Republicans, and will this support adequacy funding within the coming budget?
Well, it is, and I say this respectfully as I can, but it seems like every time a group of lawmakers are tasked to be on a commission, I think it further, watch my French, morphs these formulas even more and creates even more winners and losers. Certainly, there are school districts out there that last year, even under those adequacy formulas, that I think one school district, I was just having a conversation today in one of our members' districts that saw a $15,000 increase in what they got. Where you saw others getting $5 million or whatever the number might have been across the state. And what conflates this issue even more, where you're seeing the winners and losers argument is, I will say and I'll just use Lancaster County as an example. The school district that usually claims they are the most underfunded versus their peers is the same one that's getting 3 to 4 times more state aid than the rest of the school districts around it in Lancaster County. and then they get higher property taxes to make up the difference. Um, that
Which school district is that?
School District of Lancaster. And when you conflate that with they're down about 13 to 15% in enrollment over the last 3, 4 years, that is a very hard pill for a lot of other school districts to swallow. If you recall, last year, the budget was about, what, a week late, I think it was, and finally getting it done 2 weeks late. If I were to tell you that the big arguing point, and you may have covered it because people were talking about it, was data, right? People wanted to use self-reported data to implement the formula, and that was a no-go for us. It made a massive difference in how even the adequacy money was going to be distributed. And so that's why the budget was delayed. We wanted to use census data. We wanted to try to use something that we could have some sort of the ability to audit this information than relying on self-reported data. It greatly skewed the numbers. There was a lot of frustration coming from the other side of the building. I will tell you, and I have no problem saying this, that when people threw their hands up and said, okay, we'll go with your data, but what are we going to do for these 11 school districts? There were certain ones that they wanted to do it. And see, and that unfortunately is too much the story of Pennsylvania in the winners and losers argument, is the fact that, once they receive that money is baked into this hold harmless formula and it never goes away. And so if you have school districts losing 13% of their enrollment, if you have other ones that are much larger that are down close to 20% in their enrollment over the last 4 years, that's a little tough pill for other school districts that may be slightly growing or have really high property taxes to see that they're still getting more of this money coming. And to me, when I see the direction this is going, I think our funding formulas are needed such a massive simplification versus where we're at right now. And until that happens, we're going to see these disparities to the point where we have schools in Pennsylvania that are educating students at close to $40,000 a year. Our data always runs a year behind. I can't imagine over the last 2 years what's gone into this pot when the new numbers come out, what the numbers will be. But how is it that you have some schools that are spending $40,000 per child, others spending $14,000 to $15,000 per child, and call that equitable? And when you overlap two important subjects, if you overlap proficiency outcomes over that same look at who's getting what, and you overlap enrollment loss on it as well, it really is maddening when you see where the money is going, what the results we are getting, and where they're losing kids tremendously. It's just not where it needs to be. And I am in the camp that you should have assistance for schools that have poverty. You should have assistance for special education, and have these different pots. But no way is Pennsylvania in a position where you say that every kid in Pennsylvania is equitably worth this dollar amount, and then you build onto it. It's not even close to being that, and it's very frustrating with a lot of our members.
Well, and I understand that, but like my understanding with adequacy is half the point of that number is supposed to be representing that you have students, like some students you might need more money for a district if you're in a student that is in a school from before the Civil War that maybe doesn't have air conditioning. Maybe there's lead in the water, so some of the water fountains don't work. They don't have money at the students, the families. They don't have access to money to get the same technology. They might not even have food before they go to school, which is why the General Assembly has agreed to, issues like putting a universal school lunch or breakfast on the table. So like, it seems like that number is just trying to represent that not every kid is equal, and that's just the material reality of the world we live in, and there's a need to address that in the state funding. Isn't that the case?
It is the case, but I would still say that it is so out of whack right now because you're basically saying that there is no poverty or no kids with special needs or kids who are starving that are in the other school districts that are on the short end of the stick. It's almost like saying in an urban area that, yes, you have poverty, but you also have, let me look at the city of Lancaster. You also have a lot of redevelopment and economic activity and $1 million condos, School Lane Hills, which is a real nice neighborhood, versus a Manham Township, that is on the lower end of my scale in terms of what they get, but they still have some poverty. They still have special education needs. They still have a lot of the things that you're talking about, but we we still can't justify why is it 4 times, it might even be up to 5 times the amount once we see the updated data of state aid. Like that's what can be frustrating about how we're doing this. And in no way is this a political argument I'm making, because you probably can find R's and D's on both sides of this issue, and how we look at hold harmless, how we look at how the money's distributed. And there's just a lot of frustration. And in today's day and age, it's more easy for school officials to see what their peers are getting in their school district and all these different categories, to show them some of these disparities. And I think it's led to a lot of frustration.
What one other and I will try to ask quicker questions too. Like I have more to get to,
All
but I
right.
am no cyber charter schools. Auditor General Tim DeFore, a Republican, put out a report that said that he thought that the formula that's used to reimburse them for attendance needs to be reformed. It's based off of numbers that are coming up on, I believe, 2 decades plus old. And also school districts that did get adequacy dollars, rural and urban alike, said a lot of those dollars went to paying for cyber charters. Is cyber charter tuition reform on your list for this budget?
It is, but I think there's ways the better ways to do this than even what we have seen. First and foremost, it's an option that a lot of families do use in Pennsylvania. Certainly through COVID, when a lot of schools were refusing to open up, that families use to get their kids educated. But it's a real interesting dynamic. I kind of fall in a camp that it's very frustrating that you could have a cyber classroom where if you have 20 kids and they come from 20 different school districts, that there's 20 different funding formulas or rates for that same exact classroom. Like, given that Pennsylvania has 500 school districts and they all could be 500 different rates, I fall more in the camp that if you truly want to have a fair system, is that you should, if the parent chooses to do cyber, I would prefer that we get this out of the local politics of schools, and really focus on saying, okay, the state will pay the cyber rate, and we'll negotiate what that rate is across the entire spectrum, and make it as fair as it can be, based on what the costs that they have versus the 500 different ways that it's done currently. And when you add in it the bureaucracy of billing and the back and forth and people holding things, like for me, there's a much simpler way to do this that I wish we could do. Because then if people are complaining about cybers on the local level, it's more about whether or not they support that choice option or not. I hear so many different arguments about this. Oh, well, the school district has cyber. Why do we got to pay for cyber? Well, not all cybers are the same. I know school districts, you have synchronous and asynchronous types of education. One is sending just links, so you watch a video and you take an exam. Another will be a live teacher in the classroom and they're interacting with the students. There's different ways of looking at this. I personally believe that there's a more efficient way that's fair to everybody and takes away the local politics out of it, than if the state just handled it. And that's ideally what I would love to see. We could have the IFO did a report. If you recall years ago, the IFO did a report and they had said what a statewide rate would look like. And I think at the time, even Wolf's Department of Education, former Governor Wolf's Department of Education kind of signed off and said, yeah, rather do it simply that way as opposed to the way it's done now. I just think it's not fair to it's the schools, the cyber charters, the families involved. I think we should simplify it.
Would you want the dollars for that if you mentioned it was a state rate? Would that like that would seemingly free, local school districts some of their money because obviously they're paying those tuition now. But would you want would that be a new budget line? Would that be coming out of the basic education? Would that be new dollars going to the state? I'm just trying to make sure I have that right.
Well, last year they did something which I wasn't, 100% in agreement with, and that was they did a cyber charter reimbursement, and
Mhm.
that impacted people in a million different ways. For me, ultimately, I want to pay for kids who are in school. But right now, the way we do things, if let's say you lose 25% of your enrollment in your school, whether it's the cyber charter, whether it's to they go to a local Catholic school, they go to a charter in that local neighborhood. Right now, that school district will never see a penny less than they did the year before, even if they lost 20% or 25% of their enrollment. And so for me, how we get to, are we educating what our true number of kids are in our schools? What's the value of each child from a basic education level? Not talking about the rest, the special ed, the poverty, the English as a second language, or whatever it might be. That should all be add-ons. But we need to get to that point because you're seeing such fluctuations in the enrollment data that the hold harmless is really starting to hurt us budgetarily. It's starting to hurt other school districts. And in a weird way, it's something, if it's not fixed, I think is only going to continue to get worse. And if the projections that we're hearing, where they say like over the next decade, they're talking that we could lose another 17% of school age children enrolled in Pennsylvania schools. How is that reflected in fairness to the taxpayer, or how money's divvied up around the state to the different school districts? I think it's going to be a true challenge for us to grapple with that and fix it. For me, if we simplified this more, I think we'd be able to react better towards that. But right now, obviously, I would say that would be a cost that I see the state taking on. But I also believe that eventually we need to right size where we need to right size, because you're just harming other students in other school districts if we don't.
Mhm. Um,
And taxpayers shouldn't have to double pay for kids either.
one one question, the budget is about the dollars and cents of state government, but as we both know, it's also one of the only times the General Assembly can come together on a deal on a number of other topics that get drawn in to the broader conversation. Energy is an issue that's top of mind. PJM warned just this week of potential power shortages coming summer. Governor Shapiro has proposed his lightning plan, which calls for cap and trade on carbon emissions for power plants, as well as a state energy board to permit new power plants, and more ability for consumers to get access to solar, and some other proposals that are added on. Do Senate Republicans support that? Do they have a counteroffer to that? With PJM's warning, it seems like this is going to be an issue where just saying no is an option.
So that, I mean, this issue, we have been more than clear with the governor since day one. Withdraw his appeal on the Reggie lawsuit for many different reasons. One is so he can come and engage us in crafting energy policy. Secondarily, is it's really truly harming investment coming to PA. It's creating a lot of uncertainty. PJM has been making this, warning us about our ability to meet capacity needs for a very long time. And that's even worsened given the fact that you now have more and more energy users, especially if you think data processing centers and other things that have been added onto the grid. I think the whole attacking of PJM and somehow trying to blame them for this was really misguided and quite upsetting to see this. And the same mailers I got in my mailbox urging us to thank Governor Shapiro for taking on PICO and PPNL and PJM. That same exact mailer was sent in Maryland and said, please thank Governor Moore for doing this and all. Quite frankly, that was nothing more. They know that the energy cost increases are coming, and are not just coming for Pennsylvania's and our household energy bills. It's coming for our hospitals. It's coming for our schools. It's coming for our manufacturers and food manufacturing. Everything goes up when the cost of energy goes up. And so the sheer fact that we are not adding more baseload capacity when Pennsylvania needs it, on the heels of really ugly situations that have happened in Texas where people die, when you just saw Spain and Portugal in the dark recently, to me is maddening. We have to produce that baseload capacity. And unfortunately, most of the things that you saw in the queue with PJM were renewables. And it's important to know that most of the things that are proposed on the renewable end do not happen because they can't get necessarily the financing, or they were looking for special tax breaks and they couldn't get them. So financially, their project numbers didn't work. You see controversial ones like windmill shores off the coast of New Jersey, which the citizens did not react well to, and they don't happen. Or the local community finds out that it's going to be a 30, they need, hundreds and hundreds of acres of farmland to be covered with solar panels. They don't react well to that. There's many other reasons why these things don't come to fruition. To put it on PJM's lap is wrong. What bothers me is the premature closure of a lot of our baseload capacity. You would hope that the markets will allow them, like an old coal-fired plant, to convert to natural gas, or You find the Renovo project, which was in the queue, they decided to pull out with where this environment is going here in Pennsylvania. All you have to do is look to our neighbors in West Virginia and Ohio and look how they've handled energy, and you see ones that are growing. You're going to see more economic growth. You're going to see lower costs of energy, and it's something Pennsylvania desperately needs. And quite frankly, given the demographic decline that I referenced earlier that Pennsylvania struggles with, it's a pretty big deal when you see another plant closure and you see those folks and their job skills leave our state to go employ them somewhere else. And so this issue is the number one issue in my mind in terms of something that could help Pennsylvania, whether it's on the revenue discussions, we have when you talk about jobs in PA and lowering the cost of everything. We got to get it right. And when you double down on that and say about the importance of what energy means to people's health, what it means to be able to afford living. It's just we cannot afford to have a rolling blackouts here.
So, like for Senate Republicans, you mentioned opposition for Reggie's been a consistent point that I've heard from legislative Republicans for since former Governor Tom Wolf tried to enter it. Is there anything else that you think needs to be done? I mean, there's people who want to still let more people get access to solar through community solar, for instance. I mean, I'm just trying to look for is there a Senate Republican platform to lead to the production of more energy that isn't just like we need to make sure we're out of Reggie?
We need more, first and foremost, we need more baseload capacity. Our grid will not survive. And if people, I wish I could hold up a chart in front of you now of what's being produced by intermittent sources versus baseload. As the baseload capacity shrinks, right, the ability to produce it, it weakens our grid more and more. And unfortunately, we're also tied into other states, right? And as we see other states rapidly closing down baseload capacity, oh, and by the way, they're also massively adding data processing centers onto our grid and other things like that. It really, that is the first premise. Are we willing to talk about other issues related to how we can develop more energy and examples you utilize? Absolutely. But what's not helpful is that right now we've kind of turned off the spigot of investment to come here in PA on the base load capacity. What we see in return, we see projects like Cuffs Run down in Lancaster County and York County, where they're looking to take over conserved and preserved farmland, take people's homes to add another water retention pond to add more hydro. Oh, and by the way, they're running the lines down into DC and the Maryland area to meet those needs as they continually shut down baseload capacity. You see the governor's lightning plan that he talks about. The problem is, Stephen, with the governor's lightning plan is it's not reflected in his budget. He didn't even book when he talks about his tax credit program. He didn't even book the utilization of it. And their secretary said, "Oh, it's our way of conservatively budgeting it." No, if you're conservatively budgeting, it would have booked the whole $100 million utilization of the former Edge tax credit, but you don't see that in his budget.
But that
So
just, I mean, sorry, Sarah, I just want to jump. I mean, that just seems like that's the typical thing. Like, there's always going to be debates in any budget cycle over what's in the book, what is it, if someone's pushing an estimate up or someone's pushing an estimate down. That's just how things go. I mean, I can remember in 2023 when there were claims the governor wanted to legalize marijuana because he threw some revenue estimates. Like, that's just kind of the game of Harrisburg, is it not? I mean, I was just asking, like, the edge tax credit is something that is in there as well. That was something that was passed and hasn't been utilized. Like, is there, I just want to have a better sense of like, what is the Senate Republican proposal to get more energy onto the grid?
you want to get more energy onto our grid? He needs to remove this lawsuit where he tried to enter into an interstate compact without the General Assembly's approval, right? And implement a $1.3 billion carbon. That's what that number is up to now. Carbon tax on Pennsylvania family, our economy, which will all result in higher costs. And that uncertainty of where Pennsylvania is going to be in this is greatly impacting investment to start up these new baseload projects or people to propose them. They're proposing them in other states around us, people who are actually not going down this road that we're going down right now with energy. And so, again, I mean, Leader Pittman, myself, Senator Yall, some others have been very clear. What a huge difference that he would make if he would take his thumb off of this something that he claimed he was not supportive of when he ran for governor, of what former Governor Wolf was doing, but instead he doubled down on it after the court ruled that implementing Reggie is implementing a tax, and only the General Assembly can do a tax. So this uncertainty is in this delay, and again, this delay is what's maddening because it's greatly impacting the state when we greatly need this economic boost. Get rid of it, come to us and talk about what you want to do now with energy policy. And that has not happened, quite frankly, especially with a one vote majority on the other side of the building. You figured he would be in here wanting to tout that. That's not happening. It's almost now. Granted, the Supreme Court has scheduled to hear this case. Hopefully, there's a decision sooner rather than later. But really, it's
Oral
our
arguments are
livelihoods that are
tomorrow.
more at stake. What's that?
They're tomorrow. Oral arguments are tomorrow.
Oral arguments, yes.
Yeah. I want to jump to some reader questions too. One that I've gotten a lot about is public transit. So, the governor proposed bumping up the amount of money that's transferred from state sales tax revenues to public transit by 1.75%. At this point, agencies across the Commonwealth, from PRT to BARTA in your own backyard, have warned of deficits and potential cuts if the state doesn't provide more operating aid. Currently, that sales tax transfer provides $1.25 billion to the 57 agencies. That's for operating expenses such as worker salaries, fuel costs, and other day-to-day expenses. And I'm just like, this is something, hundreds of thousands of people take public transit, buses, trains to get to work every day, to get around, to, be part of their local economy, part of their local community. Is this something that Senate Republicans are taking seriously? And do you think there is room for Senate Republicans to vote for a funding package that helps out transit agencies from rural to urban counties?
Yeah, listen, it's certainly going to be part of the budget discussions, and it's how much of this is going to be priority at the budget table. And as much as I've heard people talk about this through the media, as someone who sits as part of that negotiations, I'm a little stunned because I don't see people in past years making the same push. Um, Last year after the budget, the governor obviously did the flexing of highway funds to get more money to help out with that situation. But at the end of the day, what we expect and what we've been very consistent in saying, and I just met with SEPTA administrators last week when we were in session up here too. They want to see, especially dealing with SEPTA, they want to address the, how often they haven't really raised rates much going back to I think prior was 2017 or 2014 off the top of my head, some of the big ones. But in the meantime, during that same period of time, people certainly saw the price of gas and what they're paying in taxes go up over that period of time. They want to see every agency engage in their efficiency and route evaluation studies. Mine in the South Central Transit Authority, which is when we merged Berks and Lancasters together back in my commissioner days, you want to make sure that you have routes that are actually being utilized. And if you're not using them, better allocate your resource to other areas. SEPTA also has been a focus on making sure that they were addressing the safety aspect, that they were addressing what we call fare jumpers, which has been a tremendous problem in those areas. We want to see them also help themselves. And if you recall sitting in the hearings, I was a little stunned to find out that they had paused their efficiency evaluation. I think a lot of us were surprised when the only thing when in terms of addressing rates at first was they removed a discount that was given to certain people prior. And those things are important when you come to the table. I understand, that what especially SEPTA or in Pittsburgh or even in Lancaster, what it means to those utilizing it, what it would mean to traffic congestion if they did not have it. So you're not going to find a SEPTA hater in me in any ways, but I do think they owe it to the taxpayers to be as efficient as possible, especially when you're asking for a state that already has a massive structural deficit to give up another $250 million of its revenue. And so I'm sure there'll be give and take, and I am interested to see how much do they want to push this at the table versus some of their other traditional priorities that they have. And at the end of the day, will something happen? Probably more than likely. I just don't know what that'll be yet, what the agreement will look like at the table.
And I want to bring up, you brought this idea of SEPTA's efficiency. They were undergoing the bus revolution, which was a plan they had to try and, right size their bus system, figure out what bus routes were working, what weren't, how can they reallocate resources. And they paused that because of their concerns about funding. And so I say that not to hammer the point of transit per se, but it seems like there's always this a phrase that's thrown around in business is that you have to spend money to make money. It seems like SEPTA is maybe in that position, and it's a broader thing with government, for instance, that like it seems like there are cases where, yes, I understand it's taxpayer money, but are there not places where sometimes you have to put in a little bit more out of taxpayer money to make sure that the return is proper, such as SEPTA had? Or last year there was a higher education where the General Assembly, divided though it was, agreed to put more money in the higher education, and there are now returns to show for that. Aren't there places that that's just what needs to be done to make sure that a public service is working for the public good?
You do, but you also have to hold that any public entity needs to be held accountable. And, I've had conversations with them. I think they even have internal beliefs that they need to get their management salaries under control. They also really believe that there was some extreme mistakes making, if you recall, the contract with China to get new buses that fell through. They're still fighting to try to get that massive amounts of money back. But you also have to say, remember, we also have the benefit of seeing what other transit agencies around the state have been doing as well too. And so they're not just on an island. And so you see other ones looking at doing things and how they can be more efficient and how they're doing things to serve the public. We have that to look to. And then you have the aggravating circumstances. Of course, there's going to be, remember, we had a local district attorney and how he was handling a lot of the cases that were occurring there, to the point that we had to create in bipartisan fashion a special prosecutor to potentially deal with things so people were able to utilize the system. When I used to go down chairing education and go down and visit schools in Philadelphia, I get to listen to those concerns of, because SEPTA was used as their school busing system where parents were refusing to allow their kids to ride it because the safety issues weren't being addressed. So, this all comes together that hopefully that there's leverage in this as they need money, but we also realize they have other things that they need to fix and get right and work on. And we've had some very productive conversations, with them about this, but those things have to happen in part of the bigger global deal so that long term it is sustainable, safe, and does exactly what the mission is supposed to be. And it's no different than how we should hold any of the systems accountable. We also get the insight of hearing from our other local transit administrators and getting their take on where this is all going and what their needs are. And so we'll take that all into consideration as we come up with what the final number is. I think it's even more important, for me, and I shared this with Secretary Munson in our budget hearings, is if the Commonwealth is going to be giving up another potential $250 million or more in this area, if that's a priority for them, then they need to work with us in other areas of the budget too, to make sure that we're being as efficient and right sizing where we need the right size in other parts of this equation. Because at the end of the day, we have a financial issue we need to start fixing too and working towards.
Um, I have for some audience questions too. I have a pretty positive one actually from Sanford H, which is what are the top two areas of agreement between the GOP and the governor on the proposed budget? So I would just say to you, Senator, is there any place where you heard the governor talk and have heard him talk where you say we should 100% do that or even 50% do that?
Well, listen, I think first and foremost, something that's to be celebrated as a huge bipartisan success, which the governor is now also talking about. He wasn't last year, but if you recall, we took a historic step in reforming post-secondary education with the Grow PA program in Pennsylvania, where we're trying to address Pennsylvania's in-demand high job needs that are out there that we need folks in nursing, law enforcement, trades, science and math teachers or whatnot, and saying we really want to incentivize kids to get into these fields, and more importantly, have them graduate with less college debt and agree to live and work in Pennsylvania. And I'm happy to report that passed unanimously in the Senate, passed unanimously in the House, and it was signed by the governor. And it opened up here in mid-March. We've had over 7,000 Pennsylvanians sign up for that program. And I think that's a really big deal. We did that together. Even as it was being crafted, I worked closely with Senator Lindsey Williams and helping to pull this together as well, working collaboratively with FIA, all our college systems. So, there's definitely things that government can get right and do a good job on, and that was one of them. And I think we should celebrate that. And I think it's going to be to Pennsylvania's benefit.
And then another question we got from many readers, and you probably know this one's coming. Maybe you heard, but a bill passed the state house last week to legalize recreational marijuana. Look, this is a thing many states have done. It was one of the proposed revenue sources from Governor Josh Shapiro in his budget address. Their proposal specifically called for using state stores, selling it just like the state sells alcohol and wine. Liquor and wine.
Mhm.
And the supporters said they thought this would be a better approach to public safety and provide the state with more revenue. I mean, just on the first blush, what is your opinion on if the state should be involved in marijuana sales?
Well, I think it kind of hit here like a lead balloon. I mean, I think you saw even a proponent of it in our caucus, Senator Laughlin, probably said it best. I mean, not even as he does, and he's probably one of the biggest supporters of it on at least on in our caucus. For me, here's the problem. We also had a report that came out 2 weeks ago, and what's the name of the doctor that did it? Looking at the states that implemented it, where they basically were showing that for every dollar of revenue that it generated, a state was spending $4.50 because of it. I'm a little more in the camp of I like looking at all right, the issues in front of us are okay, there is no roadside detection system like there is a breathalyzer. No one ever gives me a straight answer when I bring up questions like, okay, well, how long does THC have to be out of your system before you let someone drive your school bus full of little kids or operate a forklift? These are serious questions that I have. We did get to the point that a lot of folks don't realize, and the reason why the state police would be banned from using it or other police agencies or law enforcement is because your ability to possess, because since it's still illegal federally, what its impact is on people's Second Amendment rights if you're actively using. So I personally don't see the pathway on any adult use at this very moment, let alone what I saw being pushed back on with the state store model that was put out there. I come from a different camp and have seen some of the impacts on young people's lives, and I'm personally not a fan, but I just don't see how that would get through the Senate.
The other thing that the governor called for in his budget address as a source of revenue was skill games. These are the slot-like devices that have proliferated throughout many bars, social clubs, whatnot. I mean, there are some serious divides in the Senate Republican caucus over how to regulate them. You've had people who suggested tax rates as low as I believe it's roughly 15%, and you've had people who say it should be at casinos about 50% plus. Is there a middle ground there, and can we expect Senate Republicans to put forth a bill this month and this coming month to provide at least some of the revenue that we were talking about at the top?
Listen, I 1000% hope that there's a middle ground that can be found on this issue. I think there's definitely an opportunity. The other thing you didn't bring up, which also kind of complicates the issue more, is you also have a court case that in Pennsylvania it said it wasn't gaming per se. So, but I'm hopeful that we can get all these stakeholders together and do what's right on this issue. The other point of this is where do you draw the line right from the beginning? Do because a lot of people started utilizing these things when they were being, forced with certain COVID requirements in their places of business, and they use this for their livelihoods when they got it started up. And of course, they're everywhere now. I think they're in laundromats. You got people making their own mini casinos out of them, restaurants all over the place. Where do you draw the line for enforcement right off the bat? I think is going to be very important because obviously, if you make that too small, then you're going in and you're going to forcibly remove them from Pennsylvanians' places of business all around PA. And so what that end system looks like is really important. But I do believe it's something that we absolutely need to do, and it would be a source of revenue that could build up. The numbers vary depending on whose tax rate you're using or what the licensing fee would be, perhaps. But at the end of the day, we've grappled with this issue for a very long period of time. It hasn't been easy to find the landing ground, but I think each year that goes by, I feel we're a little bit closer, perhaps. So hopefully, we'll see something come in this area, because again, they're out there, they're not being taxed. There's people making a tremendous amount of money on it, and quite frankly, I personally do believe that it's also leading to some of our issues with our lottery fund right now as well, in terms of the structural imbalance that it's creating there as we're seeing impacts on revenue.
Would this issue be easier to solve if every lobby shop in town wasn't employed on one side of the issue or the other?
Well, listen, I just think there's so many stakeholders in this issue. You go back to when gaming was started, and it was really on the backs of like the horsemen and the race scene. There's so many people who've had different. Then you have the VGTs that are out there as well. At the end of the day, no one could say that this has not had an impact in Pennsylvania, whether it's on the level of iGaming or not. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but it's definitely had an impact. They're there. They should be brought into the fold like other forms of gaming. But it needs to happen sooner rather than later. And I'm really hopeful that we can come to an agreement on it, because it definitely needs to be addressed.
I want to fit in well, actually two more questions if you can bear with me. One is just
Sure.
very quickly from Yvonne H. She asked about the budget for state mental hospitals and mental health writ large. I mean, that's an issue that seems top of mind for me, given the situation with the governor's mansion arson, with Cody Balmer, where this is someone who seems to have dealt with some mental health issues. His mother attempted to find some help, buddy who would help, and she wasn't able to. Are there serious conversations going on in the Senate Republican caucus about providing more money to mental health? County's been asking for more for years to maybe, in terms of we're talking about spending money to make money. It's an issue when people with mental health don't have treatment when they, let alone when they try to do something extreme if that happens to be related to the mental health. Is this something you're looking at in the budget?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we hear from all the stakeholders all the time. I will say that we've been trying to work with the counties. As a former commissioner, I talk to a lot of my former colleagues in that association often as they look at what the mental health allocations are. We were on track for increases of about $20 million every year for a little while. I know they're seeking a much larger number. For me, I think again, this is where we need to look at um, another example. I'm just going to say this: is we see these ballooning costs in a program like Medicaid that is at the rate and what it's covering grow tremendously. It starts to have impacts on your ability. And it's certainly not the only thing. As you know, over the last probably decade, education has seen significant increases over the Wolf years and in the recent couple of years, last 2 years with Governor Shapiro. You look at your whole picture and what you do over here. If you're not doing it right or you're letting it get anywhere out of control, it impacts your ability to do other things. It could be mental health. It could be kids with developmental disabilities. It could be children and youth. There's other things that it impacts. And so, but behavioral health, and I remember the days eons ago when parity was the fight and trying to get parity in our healthcare system. But I'm a big believer that if you can serve people wholly, including whether it's from a behavioral health perspective, whether it's an addiction perspective, you can, for me, total population health and how we deal with individuals should be how we're looking at this. And supporting behavioral health is good. I don't believe we should be creating new behavioral health or mental health entities within our school district system. I think that is not a good move. I know there was an investment there with schools last year of about $100 million. I think it's better that we work through the hubs in the community, the counties and the providers for behavioral health. I think it's a better use of our dollars.
Is there a reason in particular you don't want to see it through schools when, that I mean
Yeah.
that's a frontline resource that many
Yeah.
people do have access to.
Well, and most counties will tell you, most of them are in the school districts with their caseworkers. I just feel like it was kind of a duplication. The worst thing you could see, especially when it was one-time federal dollars, was to see school districts using the higher school psychologists, right? There's a better way. There's professionals in our community that do this with that could use our support instead of us creating new long-term legacy costs with pensions and other things to have like one person in a school. I just think there was a better way of doing it. And does it make sense that if you have a kid who's a caseworker already with county government, that you're working through them and that plan they have for them and the providers they have, instead of having another caseworker in a school district during the day and then you're going to have one after school? Like, to me, it's not the best use of our dollars. We also greatly need, and I'm glad you brought this subject up. You can tie it to Grow PA as well, the program I talked about. We have a huge need for workforce in serving the needs of behavioral health throughout Pennsylvania. We're trying to financially incentivize people to get into this workforce. We're trying to also find ways to open up more behavioral health facilities in Pennsylvania. It's one of the number one issues that we hear, whether it's in the juvenile justice system, whether it's other counties looking to have providers available to them. There's definitely, and I can't wait to see the data to see how many people actually chose that as the high demand occupation, but we need more of that workforce here in PA.
And my last question is just going to be, there's so much uncertainty on the federal level when it comes to what their budget's going to look like. There's so many programs, as we talked about at the top, like Medicaid, that are split. Do we support doing a temporary budget until fall, a short-term budget to try to get the state through to then, and then take a more serious approach once we know what the feds are going to do for,
Yeah.
with their spending?
No, I get exactly what you're talking about. It almost kind of reminds me of what we did, if you recall, back in 2020 in COVID. We didn't know no idea where the world was going, right? What the revenues would end up being. So we did a two-part budget. I will never shut the door on that. There is part of me that watches as, I see the House is proposing a bill here or the president's proposing this, that if there's that much uncertainty, I think we'd be foolish not to look at what that potential option might mean, because they run in obviously in October budget cycle when they look at implementing things. Does that make sense? I'm open to that idea, because obviously there's great intertwining on things like education, human services, Medicaid, which is the real big one that it could severely change, and it could impact you financially one way or the other. And so sometimes not locking yourself in for the full year might be something that we might have to look at. So I don't rule that out. Because of that uncertainty, you might have no choice but to potentially think of something like that, because you can't predict the future.
Mhm. And with that, we are 6 minutes over. Hopefully, that's not a huge haybringer of what comes in June, but we shall see. Senator, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everyone who watched on your Monday evening. And apologies anyone whose question we couldn't get to, but appreciate all the engagement we had.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for joining us, Senator. And just a reminder, this will be available on Spotlight PA's website, where all of our events are shown. Thank you again for your time. Please keep in touch. There'll be more budget news to come. Thank you so much, everyone.